Let me ask about another conference finalist and what could be next for them. Carolina. Florida made quick work of them in a gentlemanly sweep. What's next for them and the composition of their team? And Eric Tulsky, we saw his tweets from a couple days ago just thanking fans for the year that was. But they need to find a way to get over the hump, too.
They do, but I'd say I'd be pretty excited as a Hurricanes fan because that organization, more than most others that have been a top team, like they're not afraid of change, right? Like they let a lot of players walk away as free agents last summer rather than, perhaps pay them at a level they weren't comfortable with for whatever reason. The whole Mikko Rantanen thing, like I think some people were using it to dunk on the Hurricanes at times during the year. I never understood that. I mean, to me, it's like they went all in on a guy. They didn't get him to sign but they at least had that exclusive window to try to do so. And then they flipped him and did really well on the accompanying trade. Like, I don't see how that, like, to me, I don't see how that's an example of like more and more teams should be operating that way. It's almost like they're thinking 2 or 3 moves down the road instead of just like what's directly in front of you. So I think the Hurricanes are going to have a bold offseason. They do have cap space, different circumstances than what the Stars face. And would not surprise me in the least when we start talking about the Mitch Marner situation with a little more urgency as we get closer to July 1st, if they're a team that's in on Marner. I do think that they feel that they'd like to have more of a superstar presence in that lineup. That's what Rantanen represented for them in the 6 weeks they had him on the roster. I know it didn't go great in that 6 weeks period. It was kind of a strange time, the Four Nations break. But, that was the ethos behind the decision. And, I think that they're going to go out and try to, in any way they can do so, bring in that kind of force to their team. And that makes a whole lot of sense. We know they tried to trade for Marner, for example, already once. He blocked the move at the time, or he didn't consent to waiving his no movement clause. But I think it's a totally different proposition in free agency, depending on where the numbers get to, too, right? I mean, to me, one of the interesting things about the Marner situation is, some of the we'll call them more obvious teams that tend to attract free agents. I don't think that those teams are going to be as incentivized to go financially where some other teams might for Mitch Marner. And so perhaps a team like Carolina, maybe it's Chicago. I'm not sure if Utah is going to get involved there, but maybe if Utah wants to step up, like they might be able to take the numbers to a different level for Marner and give him something to think about. And, my understanding of how Marner is viewing this is he and his camp, they want to see what's out there. Like, I think that I don't think that there's a whole lot of like automatic no's, in terms of like where their thinking's at. I think that they want to approach this with open minds and see what's possible. And so, I don't mean to say that it's only Mitch Marner or bust for the Hurricanes. I just think that any top quality player that's available in any way, shape or form, Marner's the one in free agency. That's pretty apparent, but we'll see what the trade market yields. I think Carolina will be knocking on all those doors and considering those options. And, as I say, I think they're a pretty fearless front office. And, Eric Tulsky's made no secret of the fact that just because maybe the Rantanen thing didn't turn out exactly as he might have hoped back in January, it's not going to dissuade him from taking big cuts in the batter's box. And so when we talk about interesting teams this offseason, I think Carolina has to be pretty high on any list of organizations we might rank in that regard.
As we transition into Ask CJ, as we're talking about Mitch Marner and potential destinations for him, T.A. Neiman asks, has Chris heard anything out of Vegas? I know people keep talking about Marner, but there have to be major moves to fit him. Just curious if there are any movements coming with VGK.
I think the Marner Vegas talk is a little overblown. Look, you can never take Vegas out of any major sweepstakes because of the DNA of the franchise and the obviously the history of moves that we can point to. But when I look at this free agent class, I think it's more likely we see Vegas land a Sam Bennett than a Mitch Marner. I think that he's a little bit more up their alley and, he's not going to come cheap by any means. I think that you're looking at a different level of contract to get Bennett there. It's not to say that Vegas don't like Marner. I think frankly, there's 32 teams in the league that like Mitch Marner, in terms of they see what he can do on the ice. Affects you of both ends in terms of being a top defensive player, but also had 102 points this year. I mean, it's not a question of liking or not. It's how motivated are you going to be to stretch to make it happen? And right now the Golden Knights don't have a lot of cap space, which again hasn't worked against them in the past. I just think that somehow there seems to be this notion that they're like the favorites. I wouldn't call them the favorites to land Mitch Marner. It's probably almost a little too soon to be ranking the likelihood of any team, but I do think that the Golden Knights, if Sam Bennett gets to free agency, who's number 2 on the free agent board that's dropping on Tuesday at The Athletic, if anyone wants to check that out, I've compiled it over the weekend, but I think Vegas might be swinging harder for number 2 than number 1 if both of those players end up going free.
Stay tuned for CJ's insights on his free agent board on the next edition of the CJ Show. Next question from Talon Jenkins. Lane Hutson contract predictions.
Well, great story by Arpon Basu at The Athletic, our colleague, really diving into the various layers of this onion in terms of how it goes. Basically, for those who aren't up to speed on it, Hutson, while only playing one full season in the NHL this year, likely going to win the Calder Trophy for that season, was a historically high amount of points for a defenseman, I think top 3 all time in his first NHL season, is eligible to sign an extension a year out as of July 1st. And I think the question becomes what makes sense for the team, what makes sense for the player in this case. And we've seen the Canadiens in the past with Juraj Slafkovsky, Caden Gooley as well, I believe, both signed their second NHL contracts with, basically a year before their entry-level deals expired. So we've seen the Canadiens act quickly in the past to get ahead of this sort of thing. And, I believe Montreal will at least have those exploratory conversations with, Lane Hutson's agent ahead of time just to see if there's something that can be done. But this isn't maybe the time for any player to be overstretching in the sense of security is always going to be appealing, right? And so there might be a number where it makes sense for Hutson to sign this summer, and might be even a little bit less than what he could get if he waits. But, he wants to take, if he gets the Jake Sanderson contract, right? Something like 8 times 8, a little bit more than 8 million, but, ballpark 8 times 8, maybe that appeals to him. But, to me, there's no harm as a restricted free agent and playing out your second year, because if Lane Hutson has an offensive season like the one he just had, if he can replicate that, if he can get better in some areas, improve, whether it be his all-around play, maybe not have to start so many shifts in the offensive zone, which of course is the coach's discretion. But the reason the coach is doing that is, there's a certain methodology there. He could easily be a $10 million player on the next deal if that happens. Now, but there's risk. Maybe he has the sophomore slump kind of idea, right? Maybe he gets injured. I'm not trying to, but there's lots of things that when a player is sitting down and having these thoughts and conversations that you have to factor into it, right? There's certainly some degree of unpredictability out there. Look I'm talking about this like he's automatically signing a 7 or 8 year extension. I mean, there's also the option, which we've seen with Rasmus Dahlin, a whole bunch of other, really strong defensemen, Thomas Harley more recently in Dallas, signing a bridge deal that comes in much below these kind of numbers. And then, on his third contract is in a position to hit a ball into the upper deck and then some. So, I think the good news of your Hutson is really it's about what he's comfortable with. But I'll say this, if he signs a long-term extension this summer, a year out, it's probably because he and his camp are willing to not stretch for every dollar, maybe just, again, wanting that security, wanting to remove the questions, wanting to put some players like the carrot of a contract here, right? Like some people, I think, respond well to that. Other people, it almost debilitates them. It's just too much on their mind. Now, for Lane, this is the first time he's gone through this as a pro hockey player, so he might not even know which camp he falls in just yet. But, all of it, you put it all together, and I think there's not as much. I don't think this has to be a top priority for the Canadiens this offseason, and I don't think it has to be for the player either. But you still have the talk just because maybe you're kind of both in the same ballpark and something can be done quickly and easily. And, on July 1st, that bit of business is done, and mean, if it's a long-term deal, it could basically, he could sign away his 20s essentially at this point in time if he wanted to do an 8-year deal this summer. That's, and that's appealing to some guys because then they don't have to think about a contract ever again, and they've got generational wealth coming their way.
Man, if only we could all be so lucky.
Well,
Jan Bulis.
I've never been as good at anything as Lane Hutson is at hockey. So